Thank you everyone for joining today. We're going to get started with today's webinar. Let's talk housing. We're excited to be joined by a number of panelists representing both national best practices and local experiences as well. I'm Valerie Daly with LISC Greater Cincinnati. We're going to be joined by stakeholders, community representatives from Westwood and Walnut Hills today, and also national expert from the Frameworks Institute. I think we all know that creating housing can be hard, and it's becoming even harder these days as costs increase, resources decrease, and that gap just keeps getting bigger. We want to talk today about how we can reduce local barriers to housing production, ensure that we have productive conversations, and that we're respectful, and how some tips and tricks and tools for how we can accomplish that. I wanted to start us off also by just framing Housing Our Future. We're in our 5th year. We launched in 2020, and the vision for that initiative really in Hamilton County and the city of Cincinnati is that quality housing is affordable and accessible to everyone in the places that they want to live. I think many of us may have seen in May, Cincinnati topped the national charts in a way that is not good. We had the biggest asking rent increase in the country. The median asking rent in May in Cincinnati was $1,460, nearly $1,500. That was up 7.4% from last May in 2024, and that was the biggest increase in the nation. So we know we've got a lot of challenges with affordability, with people being able to find places that are affordable for them to live. So with that frame, I want to give you a little bit of framing for the session and who you're going to be hearing from today. We'll be joined by residents and CDCs with experiences having conversations around development with residents, with developers in the community as they look towards welcoming new housing production. Walnut Hills is going to start us off today with the local conversation. They've had real estate investment for a number of years, well over a decade. And they've really developed a process and an engagement cycle that I think is best in class in the city of Cincinnati. So we're interested to learn from them. And they really have a focus and are clear about their objective of welcoming both market rate and affordable housing into their community, and making sure that current residents aren't pushed out as new residents join the neighborhood. Catherine Gardette of the Walnut Hills Business Group and Samantha Miller from the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation will be joining us, and they are veterans of this process. They will share their wins and some challenges that they've had along the way, and their strategies for being respectful, staying in the conversation with folks, and how they've stayed sane in the fray. Westwood offers a slightly different perspective. They've just completed their first neighborhood plan in 10 years, and it's a departure from the last time. And the intention this time around is to really welcome diversity and affordable housing. Katie Query from the Westwood Civic Association is the president and co-chair of the Planning Steering Committee. Will be joined with Greg Hand, the director of Westkirk, and they were both instrumental in making sure that there was a facilitated process that was really welcoming and open and expanded what the neighborhood wanted to accomplish. And now they're going to be challenged as they move from planning to implementation to have those conversations around specific development proposals and making sure that they can be inclusive and stay true to the community goals that were outlined in the plan. We're going to kick things off with Julie Sweetland from Frameworks Institute. Julie recently worked with a number of stakeholders, housing advocates in Cincinnati, to create a communications toolkit that helps us understand how we should and should not talk about housing, what messaging is helpful and what might be harmful for promoting our advocacy positions. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's a pleasure to join you all virtually, and it's good to be could be here talking in community because in a moment where where conversations about communication definitely need to happen in coalition and in community. As Valerie mentioned, I'm joining today representing the Frameworks Institute. We are a nonprofit based in DC. We work nationally and internationally, and we're a group of social scientists and social change strategists who study and share what we learn about the communications and cultural aspects of different social and scientific issues. And so it was a real joy to be able to take what we've studied and learned nationally about framing housing and bring that to Cincinnati, workshop our national recommendations with advocates that are working in the greater Cincinnati area to make sure that they reflect the local perspectives, local issues that are going on. I'll say whether, no matter where you are in the country, it can be really hard to lead a productive public conversation about housing issues. The stakes can feel and be very high for the people and places involved. And the risks of conversations going sideways, right, are also quite high. It can slow or even stop, progress toward ensuring that good places to live are widely available and affordable for everyone. I'm going to offer, I think, to start off, just some general thoughts, reflections, best practices in leading productive public conversations about housing issues. And then I'm really interested to hear how that perspective dovetails with and has been played out with the local advocates, neighborhood-based organizations joining today as well. So I think there are a few things we can do to frame housing issues more effectively. And by framing, I mean making choices about how we present our ideas, understanding that the way we present our ideas has real, substantial, and measurable effects on how people respond, right? How they think, act, and feel in response. We do this work, research for frame effects, right? How saying something one way can lead to a very different point of view in the response. With light of that research, doing this work for 25 years on dozens and of social issues, hundreds of studies, the first thing I always take is that people's positions, people's reactions are not always fixed, right? They are frame dependent. What people will pay attention to, how they will react, in large part is shaped by the stimulus right in front of them, the way we present the issues. So the way we frame, the first thing to remember is that the way we frame issues really, really does matter. Second is that it's important to remember that we as advocates who get up in the morning, right, thinking about how to make this topic better, how to make this issue better, we can remember that we are not our audience. The vocabulary that we take for granted really might not work, right? Might not be understood or heard the same way with the very people that we're trying to, we really need to reach and build relationships with. So, for instance, when we started to do our research nationally, we realized the term housing itself, right, comes with connotations that people who work in the sector, right, don't necessarily have the same way, right? The way experts or advocates use the term isn't necessarily the way the public hears the term. So we found that, just sometimes people assume that housing means public housing. And then, right, people are bringing in associations, negative stereotypes about supposed social disorder, right? Or the term housing can seem very impersonal and detached, which can make your communications less engaging, just seem less approachable. So even just that one word right there can be a framing fix. When we're communicating to the public, we can lean toward more common everyday terms: homes, apartments and houses, good places to live, places to rent or buy. And in many instances, it can make sense to widen the lens from housing options out to thoughtful community design, right? What are the types of communities we want to have? What are the types of communities we want to live in? So just one point that, we're not our audience, and even just our basic vocabulary might not be heard as intended. In the toolkit that my friends at LISC just popped in the chat, you can see some more examples of that. I think the phrase disinvestment and is another phrase like that, another term like that that's readily misunderstood or not fully understood by most folks. And so while it's a very important concept for us to build into right conversations about why what needs to happen in a particular neighborhood and why, remembering that it's, that people might not know the history, right? And certainly don't pack a lot of meaning into that term. And so giving concrete local examples of what we mean by disinvestment, right? Really explaining and naming examples and then using the term. That's what we mean by disinvestment, instead of, assuming, right, that saying that is going to help people realize, right, the need to right historical wrongs and ensure a more fair and a more fair allocation of resources and for communities. Our explanations really matter, right? We can talk about how high the rent is and rent burden, but remembering that people assume that rent is a personal decision. Think about your budget. What can you afford? Those sorts of things. And so really pointing out that it's not just that, say, rents are going up, but social conditions are changing, right? Our wages, our the pressures causing rents to rise, helping people see that these are not just inevitable natural circumstances that have to be this way, but are the result of our policy decisions, and things that we can influence and change as well. So those kinds of just unpacking some of our assumptions when we remember that we're not our audience. A second thing that we can do is remember that we're dealing often when conversations are difficult or not going our way. Remember that we're probably up against deep and durable mental models that are widely spread throughout society, repeated and reinforced, right, in news and media, social media, entertainment, everyday conversations, right? And we're dealing with deep and durable mental models, not necessarily bad people who can never be brought around to our point of view, right? Even if people are expressing ideas that we disagree with or may even find distasteful, remembering that that's an expression of an idea that's present in society. And those mental models may be the first thing that comes to people's minds, but doesn't have to be where they land or stay, right? It's where they start, it's not where they have to end up. So an example of what I mean by a mental model is the mental model of consumerism. Just the idea that in America, we get what we need through the process of buying and selling, right? And that mental model is not wrong. I was very happy to be able to buy this cup of coffee this morning. There is true that that happens, and that's one way that we interact and get stuff in society. But it's that mental model, if it's over applied to things like housing availability writ large, right? Then people get into the conversations or the assumptions like, well, if if you can't afford that rent, you don't have to live here, right? Or if there aren't enough good places to go around, that scarcity or that differential availability is actually a feature of a healthy market, and that's the way it should be. So that mental model of consumerism and applying it to housing, can lead to a lot of those unproductive and unpleasant conversations about housing justice and housing reform. So just remembering that those ideas, consumerism, individualism, fatalism, it is what it is. Things aren't going to get better. Those kinds of mental models are widely shared and often reinforced. And so we're dealing with those problematic ideas, not necessarily problematic people. And we can remember that people have more positive mental models available, right? And to all of us, to them. And we can reinforce those. So instead of individualism, really reinforce context. Instead of otherism, those folks, right, in those neighborhoods, have their own problems, or don't deserve these sorts of things. That otherism, we can also lift up a sense of togetherism, a sense of shared fates, that our communities have come together and done great things, right, to with and for each other. So just remembering that the way we frame issues can bring up productive ways of thinking about a topic or unproductive ways. And if we can keep leading people towards more productive mental models, then that can help quite a bit. We don't want to add to people's pervasive sense that these problems can't be solved and we're each on our own to manage the mess, right? But we do often reinforce that very way of thinking when we use crisis framing, right? Shortages and crunches and housing crunches and skyrocketing rents and broken government, right? Like, as we are really pointing out the problems that we understand we're up against as we're close to the issue, that type of framing can lead into that sense of fatalism and why bother, and therefore people should be on their own, right? Figure out your own stuff. So just thinking about the connection between the way we explain an issue, what we emphasize, and what that's going to do, how that's going to interact with people's way of thinking. All right, so we can remember that framing matters. We can remember that we're not our audience. We can remember that we're dealing with durable mental models, not necessarily bad people. And we can enter through and look for, build side doors into conversations. By side doors, I mean something that might be not the way you're walking into the you typically approach the issue, but something that's a little off to the slightly different angle, a different way of entering into the issue. So we have found often that appealing to collective values, big, enduring, cherished ideals really can, instead of just naming the issue right out the gate, that can really put the conversation on a different tenor and tone. So talking about an idea like interdependence, that every neighborhood in Cincinnati or greater Cincinnati, right, affects each other. It adds up to a bigger whole. What if we ensure that all our neighborhoods are thriving, vibrant, places to live and work and play and learn? That's going to, that what affects one community affects all communities in the region as a whole. Or to talk about the interdependence of how where we live really affects all kinds of aspects of our lives, the resources and opportunities we have access to, schools, healthcare, etc. Our sense of place and purpose and meaning. Talk about that interdependence first, before bringing in, right, specific topics. That value can often prime a more productive conversation, puts people in a different mindset. And the final thing I'll say before we get into what I'm sure is going to be a really rich and productive discussion of how some of these ideas of how that's played out locally, is to remember that we can and should continually be building awareness and understanding and relationships, not just showing up and communicating in moments of immediate activity. So to the extent that, we are always using some part of our organizing capacity, advocacy capacity, communications capacity to just help people be smarter about the issue. And, not that we need to come in and lecture, but just continually educating our constituents, our neighbors on these issues, again, divorced from or, not directly tied to a particular push for a particular project, but keeping that issue present in people's awareness, keeping it present in the public discourse, a continuous explanation of how we got where we are, what we can do about it, those kinds of those can soften the ground, right? For those more immediate and pressing and sometimes thorny conversations to take root in a productive way. So I hope that was helpful, and I'm really curious to hear what comes next. So Valerie, I'll pass the mic back to you, and we'll keep moving.
Thank you, Julie. I've had the pleasure of hearing Julie speak a number of times, and I feel like I get something new each time. I think this is really a practice for us and how we frame conversations, how we talk to folks that may not be and share the same exact values as we do. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the United Way of Greater Cincinnati for investing in this toolkit. I'd really encourage people to look at it not just from a housing perspective, but I think in a way to have more productive conversations across our community. So thank you, Julie. Now I'm really excited to turn it over to Walnut Hills. We've worked alongside Walnut Hills for a decade plus, and we're excited to have a diversity of opinions here. We've got Samantha Miller from the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation. We're going to add a spotlight now, who's joining us. And this is professional capacity that Walnut Hills has in the neighborhood, right? Staff to help support the conversation, the link between developers and residents, and how to have that productively. And then also a great addition is Catherine Gardette, that really empowers community voice and makes sure that that's very present at the table in helping shape and ensure that what development happens, what you see in community in terms of production of housing, reflects the goals and objectives and values of the neighborhood. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Samantha, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, yeah. So I have been with the Redevelopment Foundation since 2018. And so we're the Neighborhood Community Development Corporation, and we work in a trifecta with the Walnut Hills Business Group and the Walnut Hills Area Council to produce positive outcomes for the neighborhood. The Redevelopment Foundation, relaunched in 2012, I would say, after being founded in the 70s. And at that time, no one was investing too much in Walnut Hills at that time. We started with some creative placemaking. We finally got our first project financed. And at that time, the mandate from the neighborhood was market rate housing and new businesses. And that project was Treveran Flats. But already by the time that project was finishing up, we saw the need to be a lot more intentional with the development coming to the neighborhood. And that kicked off the Walnut Hills Reinvestment Plan, which has been guiding our priorities since then. So we use that as our guidebook, as well as keeping a pulse on the neighborhood, checking in with our residents in everything that we do. And as we've worked alongside the community, we've developed a process with that community. And Catherine was there at the inception. So that's kind of setting the stage, and I'll let Catherine talk a little bit more.
So Latanya, if you know the name of the streets in your question, that I may be able to give some more insight for that. So I have been a resident of Walnut Hills now working towards the 4th decade, but I've been coming to the neighborhood since I was a child growing up in Evanston. And there was a time that I can recall that we were very much siloed in the neighborhood. We had our redevelopment foundation, there was the area council, and there was the business group. And at the time, all three would be going to the city asking for project support. And the city was transparent with the neighborhood and say, the three of you need to come together and have some sense of what you want to do collectively as a community, because what you're telling us is very scattered. And from that came that working group that Samantha mentioned. And in the beginning of the working group, it really was formed at what projects, development projects were coming, because at that point, there had been a true exodus from the neighborhood. At the time, we had our one-way streets on William Howard Taft and McMillan. Businesses were leaving. There was just social service organizations were leaving. There was like an exodus happening, not just in Walnut Hills in the city, but it really was taking an effect in the neighborhood. And what happened, there were two, Kathy Atkinson, who was the president of the area council at the time, and Tim McConnell, who was president of the business group, and Jim King, who was the executive director of the Redevelopment Foundation, formed this and said, we will have a conversation together. And from that, it's developed out that we're going to say, as we move forward, we're going to look at the neighborhood to say, what do we need to do as a community for our community in the best way? As I was listening, Julie, to some of the what you were saying, the way that it is framed is very important. You know, as we look to that reinvestment plan, as the neighborhood at times has said, let's just talk about the two-way streets. Most of you on here understand neighborhood support programs. The community of Walnut Hills for many years used our neighborhood support program to say, let's do a study on two-way streets. And the neighborhood was able to build up the story that we're losing businesses because of these streets. And as those streets changed back to two-way, then the businesses came back into the neighborhood and there has been development.
And the working group is just a great example of, I think, the recipe for success in Walnut Hills, which is where the Redevelopment Foundation, the community, the residents, the council, the business group, we are all willing to have honest conversations and willing to listen to each other and willing to compromise. And it's about, I think, setting that structure so we're setting ourselves up for success from both the working group and then the neighborhood development letter of support process.
It truly, and when we talk about the neighborhood support, I believe I've had the pleasure of being, as Samantha talked about, that transition of the Redevelopment Foundation in 2012. At that time, I was the president of the board for the Redevelopment Foundation. I've been the president of the Walnut Hills Area Council and now of the business group. So my husband and I are very rooted in the community of Walnut Hills and knowing the importance of giving back, not just where you live, but where you have your business, where you play. All of that is so important in that. And from that, as we look at, I can remember being at an area council meeting when we had no process for a letter of support, and that friction that was caused because we had no process of a letter of support, and the leadership of the area council at that time saying, we are going to address this challenge, this opportunity head on. And from that is what we have is a very strategic process if a developer wants to come into the neighborhood for a letter of support. Samantha, would you like to share that slide?
Yes.
So as it is that we actually, as you see here, we ask developers to come to the working group. And this is something that the city knows that we have this process. And so we are fortunate that many times a developer is communicated from the city that Walnut Hills has a process. Then from there, that a developer coming to the working group, we now have examples of development projects that were coming into the neighborhood that because they came to the working group, those projects were able to go back and be reformatted and updated so it was going to be more of a collaborative development within the neighborhood that would benefit the neighborhood and benefit the developer. Do you want to talk
And it
about?
results in a more successful process for the developer as well. We can prepare them ahead of time, the types of questions they're going to get from our residents who, now having been through so many development projects, are going to ask questions about AMI, are going to ask questions about what kind of job would a person work that would be able to afford to live here? What is the square footage of your units? How about that bedroom? Can somebody really fit a dresser next to a bed in a room of this size? Questions like that, even down to the detail of, oh, is this a Cincinnati Planning Commission process, or is this going for a zoning hearing? How will our future engagement look on this project if we approve a PD? So we're able to prepare the developers for that ahead of time, so they have a more successful engagement session with the community. So I'll break down a little bit more just how this process works. So most of the time we'll have people want a letter of support from both the area council and the business group. So that's why we put both of them on here, and those processes kind of work together. So everything, like Catherine said, starts with the working group. And then we invite the developer for their initial presentation with short amount of time for Q&A to the general body area council meeting, and that is in person. From there, we have a planning committee meeting, and that is a great place for longer Q&A for our residents to engage and ask more questions. I'm sure a lot of folks know those community council meetings can run kind of late. So by putting the development projects having their own special meeting, we can get into the meat of the project and some of these questions that we know our folks are going to ask. And then from there, the developer comes back to community council general body, has another presentation, Q&A, and we typically hold our vote at that time. From that point, if it's approved, we issue the letter of support. Now, we do have precedent in the neighborhood that if the project is not approved, we have an additional 2 engagement sessions to kind of dig into a project. We had a great example. A project came, it was even an affordable housing project, but the size didn't fit right for the neighborhood, the size of the building, the height of the building. And so we held those additional 2 engagement sessions. The developer changed the layout, reduced the number of units, adjusted some of the parking layout and ratio. And then it came back to community council and then received a letter of support. So again, when I talk about willing to compromise, willing to engage, willing to have those conversations, both on the resident side and the developer side, being willing to do that has really resulted in success. And I'll just quickly hop over to the business group side. Same kind of process, come to the general business group meeting, have an engagement session, then come to the general business group meeting for a vote. But what the beauty of the process is, we share the planning committee meetings. So in between, they come for the longer Q&A at the same planning transportation committee, which is great. So you can have your residents and your business owners asking questions at the same time. Catherine, anything else you want to add to the process?
So there isn't anything. I will say to Nicholas' questions, at times do the Walnut Hills Area Council, Walnut Hills Business Group disagree, or do they only support development if in concert? No, there have been times that there has been a disagreement on the process. And so the business group is an official committee of the area council. So the reply always includes what the area council reply was as well. So there is the way that we communicate that for that. But it is, you know, that we talk about, Julie talked about exclamations matter. You may have heard Samantha talk about our community ask those questions. Those questions are known because there is that bandwidth and that knowledge of language that we have. It is one of the continuous opportunities is understanding the city processes for developments, because there are many. that go down a path. There truly are those that go down. It's going to go before our elected officials. There are those that it's going to go just to the zoning. There are those that if it becomes a PD, there's not going to be necessarily any direct input from residents, and there may be concerns in that. So that is one of the questions that as a community that we continually ask of the city for clarity. Is this project, which process is this project going through? Because it is important of exactly how much information the residents give ahead of time before it's voted on. There is a question in the chat also about Treveran Flats. Treveran Flats it's an interesting project in that it was a project that had been denied 3 times before it finally received funding. And
Thatcher Flats.
on Thatcher Flats. And the time that the funding came in was right when the pandemic began. So there were community engagements with the developers. Developers switched through that process so that development had community engagement. There are things in that building that we as a community, the Redevelopment Foundation as an organization, say that's not exactly what we thought it was going to be. And yet it is something that we have as a testimony, we have to say it's there because it's 1, 2, and 3 bedroom housing that is truly affordable housing in the urban core of the city.
We also had a question in the chat about how early in the process someone maybe would come to these meetings. And what we like to say to the developers is come to working group early, because we can, like we said, mitigate some of these concerns at the forefront before, they even have developed some of their plans, because we can point out some of those pitfalls, for example. But then we would say, then get yourself a little more ready before you come and present in front of the neighborhood general body. So it's like meet with our neighborhood leadership at as early as and then we can set you up for success for when you're actually ready to come for your letters of support, because you're preparing to get in front of city council. And so one other thing I wanted to say is it's great to have a neighborhood process. It's great to have an opinion in the neighborhood. And at the end of the day, I think that's all we can do as neighborhood leadership and as residents is share our well-reasoned argument, both based on our neighborhood plan that's guiding our vision and neighborhood priorities as they are now. And we usually do have success when we present that well-reasoned argument to the city, but just being aware as a neighborhood, you're going to have some wins and you're going to have some loses, because at the end of the day, the city is going to stack up your opinion against city priorities, and neighborhood priorities and city priorities often align, but they don't always. So just something to keep in mind. It's a good reason for having a strong neighborhood plan, good reason to have a strong process so you can really support your argument about what residents want and don't want. And then you take that to the city, and just being aware that at the end of the day, that's going to be measured against city priorities at the same time.
True. Walnut Hills hosted the Healthy Neighborhoods a few weeks ago, and one of the slides we had in that was affordable for whom, and that we showed the HUD schedule for the city, and we shared what the AMI is for our residents and how that gap is growing significantly. And Walnut Hills consciously, when I think of the engagement that we did for what is on the former Kroger site, to ensure that there is mixed income in all of the buildings, that yes, there's market rate, but there's 80% AMI in those buildings, and that everything, it didn't matter if it was the 30, 60, 80 building or the 80, 100, and 120 building, all of the elements are the same, that it had to be equitable across the board, regardless of what the rent was going to be in those buildings. Those were many conversations that happened for that to occur. it needs to continue to happen, because truly, if we are going to be a city that's affordable for all, the gap in building housing is the solve that needs to occur.
Looking forward to more Q&A later. Valerie, we'll hand it back to you.
Thank you both. Again, I always learn something. I've heard you both speak a couple of times within the past few weeks. And I'm really struck and thankful for your description of the process and its evolution. You know, it took a while and a lot of effort to get to where you are in a very strong position, I think. But that takes leadership at its foundation, right? And it takes consistent, engaged, committed, long-term leadership from both of you and many others. So I thank you for that. And it also takes strong leaders that are willing to collaborate, which I think is also a special asset that often, you know, isn't well valued or present. So I thank you for your demonstration of a process and a collaboration and a spirit of everybody working together and allowing and supporting that platform that does allow for, Catherine, you mentioned the engagement and education of community leaders to be knowledgeable about zoning codes and parking requirements and a whole host of different factors so they can effectively engage in conversation. So thank you. Now we're going to move to Westwood. Greg and Katie, I think, are both here. I know Katie was having some computer troubles, but she's made it.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. So Westwood, as we mentioned, just celebrated adoption approval of your neighborhood plan by the city of Cincinnati. I know that is a long process, so congratulations on that huge accomplishment. And now, as we like to say in the planning world, the hard work starts now, right? Even though you spent so much time engaging with the planning process. So we're really excited to have this contrast of Walnut Hills, who adopted a neighborhood plan a number of years ago and has been working on how they engage with development that's coming to their neighborhood with projects. And you're kind of, I think, at a different spot in your evolution and re-energizing of the neighborhood. So we're excited to hear your reflections on how you're working with residents and engaging in that development process.
Great. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Katie Query, and I'm the president of the Westwood Civic Association. And just want to also shout out and thank Walnut Hills for sharing their story. I feel like I learned so much as a neighborhood that is maybe where Walnut Hills was a decade or so back. I feel like we have a lot to learn from you all. And I'm joined here by Greg Hand, who is on the West Kirk board. I'm going to start off by just sharing a little bit of context in our neighborhood planning process and a little background on our neighborhood. Even though we are the largest neighborhood in Cincinnati, and if you ever talk to people from Westwood, we will always shout that to the rooftops. But I'm always surprised that a lot of people actually either have not heard of Westwood or don't know a lot about it. So I will share a bit about that, and then we'll pass it off to Greg, who can share a bit more about what it was like being involved in our neighborhood plan process. So as I said, we're the largest and we are also the most diverse neighborhood in Cincinnati. We have about 32,000 residents, and that makes up just about 10% of the city's total population. And one thing that we learned throughout the neighborhood planning process is that our just demographics in terms of economics, racial diversity, things like that really mirrors the city in a lot of ways. And unlike what we've seen from Walnut Hills, just where they're at in the stage of kind of developing the neighborhood, Westwood has not seen a lot of interest from developers building housing in the last few decades. In fact, we haven't had a lot of new housing built since I believe about 1990, although Greg might be able to correct me on that. And then really a lot of the more recent development that's happened in Westwood, particularly the Town Hall Business District, I really think that's been a lot of led a lot by residents that were looking to make the neighborhood better, and it's been a lot of grassroots efforts, and that same is true with the neighborhood plan. So to set a little context for where we came from, our last neighborhood plan was developed in 2010, and it reflected a very different time in Westwood and different attitudes. And so there were, I think, some demographic shifts that led a lot of longtime residents to be fearful of new people that were coming into the neighborhood. And the plan, what really, like, to be honest, was just openly racist. And just a few tidbits from it that stuck out to me were that it called for less single mother-led households and the demolition of distressed multifamily properties over rehabilitation, and really emphasized the single family owner occupied housing only. And I actually, to this day, still regularly hear from people that do not want anything but single family owner occupied homes. But we know, and the Westwood leadership that is I guess, in power now has a very, very different view on the state of housing. And that's really led by what we're seeing and the need for affordable housing and to keep our neighborhood affordable as we develop is something that we kept central to the neighborhood planning process that we did in partnership with Bloom Community Partners and Liz, who is on this call. So fast forward to 2024. So last year we got to redo our strategic plan. Again, rents and housing prices in general are rising across the country and Cincinnati. I don't need to tell anybody about the inflation that we're all experiencing. So we knew there was a need. And we brought, just as we started convening as the Civic Association, as well as the 4 other community organizations that are present in Westwood, we brought that need as a central topic to the neighborhood plan, but we also brought some concerns that we were really worried about some of the longtime residents that would just blanket oppose anything that would be considered affordable housing. And I think a lot of that stems from the just a misunderstanding of what affordable housing is and lack of education on what the need is. And so that's where data has become our best friend and has really helped shape the conversation and kind of change the narrative a little bit. As I kind of mentioned earlier, there is just a stigma around affordable housing, and a lot of conversations that I've had and many others as well are that I guess a misconception that the city is putting all low-income housing into West Side neighborhoods like Westwood. And what we were able to find out is that is actually not true at all. We have, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but we have about 19,000 households in total, regardless of income. But we only have about 300 units that have a subsidy attached to them. And when you look at how that compares to the rest of the city, we're actually near the bottom in terms of affordable and low income housing based on our population size. And so we were able to use that data to kind of bust that myth, although it is still a challenge, I think, to have those conversations, because I think there's obviously some people that you're never going to convince. And even if they see a need, are not going to be for it. But I will say the data has been really helpful in just sharing the need. And then I think another big piece of it is that the data has helped us have one source of truth, so that we're not arguing about this and that, we end up getting to the root of the conversation. And what we've found is that really a lot of the concerns lie in absentee landlords and institutional investors not taking care of their property, creating urban blight, which is actually not necessarily related to affordable housing in any way. That's a totally separate problem that I know a lot of neighborhoods are dealing with around the city as well as around the country. And so, and that's something that Westwood Civic has been working on for a long time by tracking problem properties and then trying to hold absentee landlords accountable. We also just developed a developer questionnaire that was adopted by Westwood Civic Association. I would love to see Walnut Hills' process in a little more detail to learn from you guys. And it's I think going to actually just get its first test here in the near future as we have a developer who is interested in the Western Hills Sports Mall. I'm probably butchering that name, but it's basically a lot that that is ripe for development, and we do have it in our strategic plan, and we're really curious what the developer has to say. And they've agreed to complete the questionnaire, so I'm really excited that we'll be able to test it. But with that, I am going to pass it off to Greg to give a little more detail about what the process was like.
Yeah, I'd like to begin by saying I'm thrilled to see what's going on in Walnut Hills. Got to know that community maybe a decade ago. We were working on form-based codes and attended a lot of meetings downtown. And so we feel like we're a sister community and just enjoy seeing success take place. I'm also interested in the ability to coordinate among 3 organizations, because the joke is in Westwood, you have to talk to the 5 families. It sounds like the mafia. We have the Civic Association. We have 2 CDCs, Westkirk that I'm involved with, Westwood Works. We also have the Historic Association, and we have a business association. And so those 5 groups get together on a quarterly basis through a group called Westwood Coalition to do a little traffic copping. But it's largely a process that works because we're constantly in communication with one another as organizations. Katie puts out a call, and within a week or so, we get letters of support for different projects. Westkirk is working in close collaboration with the Civic Association on this list of distressed properties that Katie was talking about. And I think given a lot of this is personality dependent, but given the folks that we have in the 5 families right now, we communicate very well together. And that's both a blessing and a curse, because we tend to think that by talking to one another, we've done the conversation. And the beauty of the process that Katie and Brandon and Liz Bloom and Bloom Community Partners put together on developing the new neighborhood plan was really effective because it acknowledged this size of Westwood. Westwood is so big. We actually had a marketing study not too many years ago that identified 9 separate neighborhoods within Westwood. And even on official maps, I believe there are 8 census districts in Westwood. And so the challenge for making sure that everybody was heard in the development of the new neighborhood plan not only meant reaching out and getting everybody from all of those diverse areas within Westwood into the same room for a conversation. But getting them into the room was really just the beginning of the process. Making them heard was the really difficult part, because you know how it is. You get people to the table and you've got 8 people and 2 of them dominate the conversation. And so the process through our listening sessions was conducted in such a way that we made sure if you sat down at the table, you got heard. And if 5 people had spoken and there were 3 left, we didn't get up from that table until we heard from those 3 people. And it was very surprising sometimes to hear what the quiet people, the less assertive people had to say, because it would turn out quite frequently that the first speakers thought they were speaking for those people. And when pressed to say, no, no, you have got to say something, otherwise we're not done, they would have a very different perspective on particular issues. And so we had, for example, a lot of emphasis on what Katie described as the town hall district. It's a historic town hall district. We have 7 buildings on the National Register, and 10 years ago, it was basically vacant. We had a business district with next to no businesses. And so first order of business was rebuilding that business district. And now that created a situation where we need population density to maintain the business district. So we need housing close enough to the business district to maintain the businesses that have moved in to the business district. And the business owners are telling us, yes, we need people nearby who are customers, but I also need housing for the people who work for me. We have restaurants saying we've got kitchen staff, wait staff, and they have to commute from these inconvenient distances because there's no available housing for them. And so each step forward creates its own environment with new issues that need to be addressed. And the former neighborhood plan that Katie alluded to, with its blatant objections to anything other than single-family housing, creates a situation in which you would find people talking about, well, there's Westwood, and then there's the other Westwood. And if you're going to pick 2 examples to illustrate this, we have the historic Town Hall District, and then we have a brand new business district, neighborhood business district at the intersection of Harrison and McHenry on the eastern edge of Westwood that has become a focus for Westkirk, my organization. We have been working with developers to build affordable housing on a number of vacant lots that we have in that eastern sector. We have an NBDIP grant to build a gymnasium because the young people on that side of Westwood do not have access to recreational facilities. And in the neighborhood planning process, we were able to identify 3 or 4 available tracts in what used to be called the other Westwood that are ripe for development. And as we get into implementation, we're now moving into seeing what we can do to open that area and start talking about one Westwood.
Greg, I want to quickly respond to Latanya, who actually was involved in the neighborhood planning process, made a comment in the chat here that I think is really important, that moving forward, we need to work on getting more people to the table. In Westwood, again, as the largest neighborhood, we have a huge amount of voices that we need to get involved in these discussions. And I definitely think that that's a growth area for Westwood, and probably other neighborhoods too. It's something that I think we're sort of just scratching the surface on, and would love to hear from others too about how they've ensured diverse representation, not only on the steering committees for neighborhood plans, but also in their community groups and these types of discussions.
I think there's a question about the grant that I mentioned. It's NBDIP, Neighborhood Business District Improvement Program. It's an annual process available through the Cincinnati Neighborhood Business Districts United. They're in the process right now, I think, of evaluating proposals for that program. It kind of runs during the spring, and then awards are announced in the summer.
Thank you both. We appreciate it so much. We're going to have lots of people join the screen now as we move into Q&A. And I just want to say, I think it's so helpful to hear the perspective of a neighborhood that's kind of at the front of this process. You've seen some development and a part of the business district. You've been successful at attracting some businesses and investment, but now really you're turning to shaping what future development would look like that's consistent with the neighborhood plan that you all have worked so hard on. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Larry Williams, who is a Housing Our Future Steering Committee member and wears many other hats. And he's also a very dedicated Housing Our Future communications team member. And he's going to lead us in the Q&A period. And please feel free, we've addressed some questions as we go in the chat, but if you think of others, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for this part of the session. So please feel free to continue dropping your questions in.
Great. Thank you, Valerie, and thank all our panelists this morning for great information you're sharing. I found it very, very interesting and very informative to hear those stories. The first question that came in, Julie, was directed at Frameworks, and what has Frameworks done to recast conversations around affordable housing to make those conversations more productive?
Oh, thanks for the question. The way we work as an organization is really different than what the other folks on the call, the type of very rooted in place work that was just described. So I think our contribution has been to offer evidence-based, research-backed ideas about, if you say it this way, this is what you get, and if you say it that way, you might get closer, right, to where you're trying to go. And then sharing that research, developing that research in partnership with folks who are on the ground doing the work, but sharing that with an ever widening circle of organizations. So to the extent that we've seen national kind of housing movements shift a little bit from crisis framing to solutions oriented framing, right? I think that's in part been one of the contributions that our research has offered. In a moment, I'll put a link in the chat to a group in San Mateo County in the Bay Area, San Mateo Homes for All. and Home for All, I believe is what it says, is their name. And they just, there's like groups like that that we've really helped try to refine their public facing messaging so that it's more inviting, more hopeful, more solutions oriented, and really much more focused on collective benefits, right? How getting this right makes it better for all of us, as opposed to a very narrow kind of interest-based group type of framing. So those are some of the things that we've offered, and there's lots of examples of folks using that locally.
Great, thank you. Next question is for our community team members. The question is, how have conversations around affordable housing changed over the years in your community, and was there a breakthrough moment? So I think if all four of you could reflect on that, and Samantha, will go the same sequence before, go Samantha, Catherine, and Julie and Greg, and give us your thoughts on how the conversations have evolved.
Sure. I think in Walnut Hills, in the reinvestment plan, we knew at that time we wanted to designate a certain amount of units affordable to folks making 60% AMI and below. But what we talk a lot about in the plan is broadening and diversifying the housing options for broader market. So we're talking market rate and we're talking affordable, and even in affordability, we're talking about that, workforce affordable, and we're talking about that like low income housing tax credit affordable levels. But I think that one of the beauty of the things in Walnut Hills is not only we have a diversity of housing, including in the affordable housing sector. We have permanent supportive affordable housing. Found House is in the neighborhood. We also have senior, we have family. And it's just important to serve all of those different markets, I think, because a healthy neighborhood has a mix of all types of housing.
I would agree with just ditto what Samantha's saying there, but also Walnut Hills is unique in that as an urban neighborhood, we did not experience redlining when redlining was occurring, and primarily because of the people who were here at that time. And the Walnut Hills Redevelopment Foundation was formed out of the Walnut Hills Area Council to ensure that affordable housing would always be in the neighborhood. So I don't know that we've had an aha moment. It's just that we've always believed that there needs to be inclusive, affordable housing for all in our community.
Julie? I'm sorry, Katie. Did you have?
I actually, I'm gonna let Greg answer this just because he's been around in Westwood leadership a bit longer than I have and has been observing the changes a bit more than I have.
That's such a considerate way of saying I'm old. But yes, I can tell you that during the development of the 2010 neighborhood plan, when you talked about affordable housing, that was almost uniformly believed as subsidized housing. And as was pointed out at the very beginning of this webinar, we're now living in the city with the highest rent increases of any place in the nation, and some of that is being reflected in the housing costs in general. And so what the environment we're working in now is a lot of residents realizing that their children cannot afford to move into the same neighborhood that their parents and grandparents live. And so affordable is taking on a very different sort of aspect. And so when we talk about housing in general, instead of talking about affordable housing, you talk about housing, and people will voluntarily bring up, can I afford the housing that you're talking about? And so I think there's a sea change going on, and something that we need to monitor.
All right, thank you for those comments. There's a question in the chat. I think Julie would be for you from Cooper. Says, how do leaders invite a complementary group of leaders toward realistic framing for residents, owners, and investors?
Ooh, that's a good one. And I'm curious. I bet there's probably learnings from Walnut Hills and Westwood as well on how to do that. But I would think about it as it's kind of a three-step process. Um, so you've got your group, right, that you want to move in concert together, right, at some future point. So you've got your inner circle there, those complementary leaders that Cooper mentioned. I would take time with that group to really make sure that you've surfaced and named and written out the target ideas, the ideas you eventually want to get across. And don't assume that those ideas are your messages, right? But you need to make sure that there's some consensus in that group on what do we want people to understand, know, right? What are the attitudes we're trying to convey here? Because people typically will not release to shared messaging. They won't get on board with shared messaging unless and until they're confident that that messaging is going to cover their agenda item, right? Get to the point they really want to make. So making sure you've come to that agreement in the room. And then the second step in that process is how do people who aren't in that room think about those ideas, right? How, what are the maybe the enduring mental models like consumerism or fatalism or otherism that might be, in coming up against those shared ideas? Or are there very specific, kind of concrete concerns, right, in this place? So understand kind of your big ideas. What are you up against, right? What are people going to think about those things? And then you develop your messaging, right? Based on that analysis. Where are the gaps and overlaps between what you want to say and what people already think? Develop that messaging and look to evidence in landing on that messaging. And looking to evidence is a little different than making sure everybody in the room likes the way it sounds. Often the evidence on what this word will do versus that word, or this argument or that argument, can really make sure you have effective messaging coming out of that room. Because if you've ever been in a group where a group, is trying to come up with shared messaging, usually one of two things happens. Either it ends up being so watered down, like everyone can kind of agree with it because it kind of says nothing, right? It's very milk toast or bland. Or it leans toward the most vocal, often most passionate voice in that room, which then ends up can end up alienating people, right? That once you kind of get out of that room. So the evidence on not how do we want to say it, but how will people hear it, can often get you out of that log jam, those life shortening meetings of just co-constructing messaging without appealing to evidence. So that's how I would approach that.
May I jump in with a specific example?
Please.
There was a question in the chat about the connected communities, and how that plays into these discussions. And I think it illustrates exactly what Julie is talking about, because the process for getting a neighborhood plan approved at the city involves going through a hoop that shows that your proposed neighborhood plan is consistent with the Connected Communities initiative. And so in our discussions, we were coming face to face with the issues that were brought up in Connected Communities and got broad-based support for them as we drafted and developed and vetted our plan. And it made it through that hoop. So our plan is entirely consistent with Connected Communities. And yet, when you talk to neighborhoods, neighborhood residents today, they will say that they oppose Connected Communities. and what it will do. And so it's the way it was framed that they heard about that term. And so they're opposed to that term, but they're not opposed to the questions that attempts to address. And I think that's an example of framing. Am I correct?
Thanks, Greg, for sharing that. I think that's an excellent example, and I think really drives home the point of the language and the words that you're using are so important. And I think that's a good way to end our Q&A. And thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to turn this over to Valerie. Valerie?
Thank you, Larry, and thank you everyone so much. I've worked with many of you, most of you, and I learned something every time, so I really appreciate you all sharing. I'm going to say my wrap up, and then I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who is actually in person with me, so we have a sort of hybrid meeting going on here. We'll turn the camera in a minute, but I just wanted to encourage everyone, thank you for joining, spending time with us. The recording for this and the resources we shared will be shared on our website early next week, so please take a look there. And we have webinars dating back to 2020 with some great local, national, different topics around housing. So please check those out as well. And I'm going to literally turn the screen to Liz here to wrap us up.
Thank you, everybody who's been on this panel. It's just the work that you do is long-term, ongoing, and it's hard. But when you do it well, as you are all describing, it really matters and it really makes a difference. And it makes your communities different and better. And so thank you for being here, but also for the work that you do all day, every day back at the ranch. I think I want to talk about 4 things that I've heard us say as we've had the last hour together. Relationships matter. You need to talk to your neighbors. You need to engage people where they are. You need, and we talked about this a lot in the Westwood plan. How do you get everybody in the room? You just have to keep inviting people. And that doesn't mean to 3 meetings. It means to events. It means to coffees, to one-on-ones. If you know there's a part of the neighborhood where you're not seeing anybody, go to them. Ask them what they think. Invite them to an event. It's an ongoing process. And I think it's important to create those kind of long-term relationships before you need to have people answer an important question. You should be talking all the time. And Catherine and Greg, I want to say, and as I look at our panelists today, they absolutely represent this. I think one of the most important things, one of the most positive dynamics I've seen in neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood is there are longtime leaders who have the history and know what's been going on for a long time, and they stay at the table, and then they invite new people who have fresh ideas and new energy and a different perspective, and they listen to each other and they respect each other and they make room for one another. And I think that's so important. And it's happened in Walnut Hills and it's happened in Westwood and it's happening in lots of other neighborhoods. But community, people get so wrapped up in their community role and it's important. But what I would say is old time leaders are important and new voices are important. And together, that's a really powerful way to make community decisions. So relationships, long-term, invite. The other thing that I've heard people say in several different ways today is that understanding the process and knowledge is important. Katie talked about data. People often argue for all kinds of time about how many affordable housing units are in the neighborhood. That's a knowable thing. Let's find it out, let's say it, and we're done with that argument. So I think having good background information, having good knowledge about the state of affairs, if you will, and then having really good knowledge about the process. I think whose decision gets made, is this going to planning commission, is it going to council? All of that can really tie neighborhoods in knots. And so if somebody in the community understands and can speak articulately to what are the processes and what's the background information, that's really helpful. And I think it can change the dynamic. Again, to the points that Julie's made, if you've got good information, it's easier to move through the process. The other thing, and maybe not so much talked about, but I think certainly Walnut Hills talked about their clear process where they invite developers to the table and they have a conversation and they know what's going to happen. Clarity about process and clarity about decision making is really important. And I think even decision making in a community, I think one of the things that we have heard people say over and over again in community is nobody engaged me. And I think often what they're saying is people don't agree with me. And I think we have to be clear about engagement, and then we have to be clear about how we're going to make a decision. And once the decision is made, it didn't mean I didn't engage you. It means the decision is different than what you had hoped it to be. Several people use the word compromise, which I was so happy to hear because development is a compromise. The other thing, and I think Samantha talked about it, maybe not in direct terms, there has to be a relationship with developers too. I think we get into this right off the bat notion that developers are the enemy. Well, they're not the enemy. If you want redevelopment in your community, what you want is for developers to come into the community and do redevelopment. The question is, how do decisions get made between developers and community? And I think how clear community can be about what it is you want and what it is that's important to you helps a developer understand where they're going to fit into the community. And I think clarity on the city's part about what they want is also important. And so community getting really clear, as Greg suggested, Westwood really likes the idea of building up housing around the town center, building up housing around Harrison McHenry. They like the idea of strengthening our transit corridors. We didn't really use the words connected communities much at all, but we talked about where new housing would go and how transit would be connected. And that ended up being connected communities. And I think that was about information, and it was about how we framed those conversations. And maybe finally, the last thing that I will leave you with, and I think I started with Julie and it went all the way through the process. Change happens in these neighborhoods. It's not going to be the way it is today because that's always the way it's been. All of these neighborhoods are very different places than they were 10 years ago. And they're very different places to the good, in part because people understood that and they were willing to have conversations and they were willing to stay at the table and push where they felt like they could push and compromise where they felt like it was the appropriate thing to do. And I think the other thing, Julie, that you said that I really am going to spend some more time thinking about, but I think these two communities exemplify it. You don't have to be on your own. It isn't like my way or there's no solution at all. I mean, I think communities together can come up with solutions. Communities together can come up with solutions, and change is possible, and positive, productive change is possible when communities collaborate. Greg talked about the 5 families. Catherine talked about the three sort of circles of energy. And when all that stuff comes together, people can make good choices, and they do. It happens all the time. It isn't always just bad. And so maybe that's where I'll leave it. Change is possible, and it happens all the time. And these two neighborhoods are a perfect example. So thank you all for being here. We greatly appreciate it. I go back to Valerie.
Thank you, Liz. That's a great way to end. And I'll just say that we're taking the summer off in the webinar series, but we are starting planning on the upcoming webinar in October, it looks like. And we're going to be talking policy, both state policy that impacts housing and federal policy. So that should be exciting. We'll see where things land by that time of the year. So again, thank you everyone for joining. We know that you could be in lots of other places, but thank you for spending time with us. And feel free to reach out to any of us or look at the website for resources. Thank you all of our panelists too. Thanks.